speak. Now, let me start by asking why FTAs. Now, Malaysia is a very small trading nation, but a heavily dependent trading nation. If you look at the statistics, I think our trade ratio to GDP is 2 times on average, if you take over the last couple of years. So it is obvious that you need a trading environment out there that is conducive for you to be able to export and sustain your exports. So we need to open markets. And you know that the multilateral vehicle that we have under the WTO is not making any headway. That is the ideal vehicle to open up trade, because that's multilateral trade. Now, the next best option we have is to go through regional and bilateral FTAs. That is from the trading angle. Now, you need free trade agreements. I think Professor just now mentioned that FTAs is not just about trade barriers. It is more than that. And one of that more is, it is an instrument that gives assurance to investors. So opening up and giving protection and having an enabling dispute settlement mechanism will give the assurance to investors to come and invest in Malaysia. The third reason is that under a structured framework like a free trade agreement, there is a lot of room, opportunity for technological collaboration. And we use FTAs to build capacity. Now, the Malaysia-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, we have signed an agreement with Japan where we actually opened up the automobile sector to the Japanese. But little do people know that in exchange for that, we have 10 collaborative projects with the Japanese to help our vendors in the automobile sector. And that is concrete collaborative projects. Now, most people don't realize the goodness of FTAs because they always look at what FTAs do to industries. But actually, very few people realize that FTAs are good for you and me, the common consumer. It gives us an opportunity to have a feel and taste of goods that are cheaper, better quality, and gives you a wider choice. So that's the opening part from our commitments. On the one hand, we ask our FTA partners to open up, but we can't have a one-way street in FTA. We have to do our bit. And by opening up, we as consumers enjoy. So there is actually that consumer welfare in FTAs. Now, for the industries themselves, by opening up, we are actually injecting competition to these industries. And because of this injection of competition, our industries have grown to be more effective and more competitive and being able to carve a bigger portion of the global market. And we don't do it in such a way that we drown all industries. We do it in a targeted manner, in a sequential manner, and by giving progressive liberalization, we are actually injecting progressive competition. So all these are actually mitigating factors where people fail to realize, because the devil is actually in the details of the agreements, which most people fail to read. They always have a one-track mind because they say FTAs means opening up. And opening up means competition, and competition means killing SMEs. No SME has died because of FTAs, let me tell you that. But on the other hand, more SMEs have been created because of free trade agreements, giving an opportunity. AFTA is a free trade agreement which has actually opened up markets for smaller players in Malaysia. We open up markets where they are able to compete in a lesser competing environment than the global market. So this helped them build capacity. Now, we have to ask ourselves, in an environment where your trading partners, your competitors are moving in a direction to carve out markets for themselves, what do you do? Now, what are the options that you have? You have an option to not participate in these free trade agreements and lose out to your competitors. That's option one. Option two is to stay out of the negotiations and then decide to accede to these agreements. Accede or join later. And when you join later, you just take what has been already decided. A fait accompli for you. That's option two. Option three is to go and take the bull by its horns and start negotiating and decide on the course of what that agreement is going to be and steer the outcome of the FTA. And that's what we decided to do in a massive undertaking called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Now, this is a big shift because all the agreements that Puan Haliza has been mentioning, we have got 12 agreements actually, 6 regional, and I think 5 plus the bilaterals, if you count AFTA together. Now, all these agreements, I would term that to be traditional FTAs. Why? Because they go into the traditional areas of market access for goods, services, investment. They don't go into what I would call the new issues, like competition policy, and now we have an offshoot of that, state-owned enterprises. Government procurement is not traditional for many countries, but it's a traditional area, it's a non-traditional area for Malaysia, because it's the first time that we are negotiating government procurement. Labor and environment. We have labor and environment treated in some of our agreements, but in a very cursory way where it's nothing but a mention for cooperation. But here we are negotiating substantive disciplines. Then we have IPR, intellectual property rights. And these are all new issues for Malaysia. But little do people who have been criticizing the Trans-Pacific Partnership realize that many of the elements in these new areas are actually reflected in our own transformation program, our new economic model, even in our Rancangan Malaysia, which have been going on for the last 30 years. So towards the end, the latest, if you look at the latest Rancangan Malaysia, you will find that some of these elements covered in these areas are actually part and parcel of the transformation that we are undertaking. So negotiating these are not new. The question is how much of the traffic can we bear? But if we decide to stay out of it, out of the TPP, and let others decide the outcome of these negotiations, and one fine day, like the Japanese have done, at the 11th hour, they decided to come into the negotiations. Sorry for them, a lot of the outcomes they have to just swallow. They have got very little left for negotiations for them. So that's why Malaysia decided after 3 rounds of negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we decided that we should get into the negotiations and help steer the outcome than to be a taker of what has been decided by the rest of the negotiating partners. Despite the acknowledgement and appreciation that there are some bullets that we have to bite in areas like government procurement. And we went into the negotiations also knowing fully well that these negotiations have got room for flexibilities, because not everybody can accept every commitment that is being proposed. Negotiations in this free trade agreements is such that anyone is free to table proposals, but we should not assume that what is being proposed by one party is going to be the gospel truth at the end of the day. These are all subject for negotiations, and people who are negotiating this agreement would want to see the end of the negotiations than to have the negotiations abandoned halfway. So for that reason alone, people will find creative ways to accept each other's concerns. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership has gained a lot of prominence and notoriety simply because of one player, and that's the United States. In all our 10, 12 FTAs, nobody condemned those FTAs. But the moment the TPP and they saw the US, they start condemning the FTA and say, let's reject the FTA. Sad to say that those people who are rejecting and asking that we abandon the negotiations fail to realize the very thing that they are asking is actually what the US wants in the TPP. People are saying we must have labor rights, we must have environmental standards. But my friends, the United States want this in the FTAs. It's countries like Malaysia and Vietnam which are saying, hey, hold on. We are not ready to have all these rights because there are certain limitations. Go and read the Constitution. The Constitution says that there are certain limitations on freedom of association. So if we accept freedom of or labor rights, there are certain things that we cannot do because our Constitution doesn't allow it. And I think one area is in the area of foreign workers having the freedom, correct me, the lawyers, foreign workers having the freedom of association. The Constitution doesn't allow it, but that's workers' rights. And that's what the Americans are saying in the TPP. But those who are condemning the TPP are saying we must have workers' rights. So you see, some objections to the TPP are not very well grounded. People are saying we must have environmental standards. Fine, I think the government agrees that we must have environmental standards, but are we in a position to actually enforce all those environmental standards? We have all the environmental legislations in place, but we have to question, do we have the resources to actually enforce this? The fault is that we don't have the capacity to enforce, and that's why we are cautious in agreeing to these environmental standards being injected into the agreements. Now, there's a lot of criticism of the US and all the proposals in the new areas. Now, I would like to throw this out to you all. What is the alternative that we have? Many of these areas that are being proposed in the TPP are new areas. That's why it's called the agreement of the 21st century, a high standard agreement. Many of these agreements are not found in international agreements, fora or bodies. And even if they are not treated the way that it is being proposed here. That means they are saying it has to be WTO plus, for instance, or multilateral environmental agreements plus, in addition to what is already there. Now, what is the alternative for us in not engaging the US? The alternative is this, that we will be subjected to unilateral measures every time the US feels that we have violated some of these standards. And what is our recourse? We can't go to the ILO. The ILO has got no teeth. You can't go to the WTO because some of these things are not treated in the WTO. So isn't it better for us to engage the US through the TPP, have a structured framework where we can deal with these issues? It's something for you all to think about. Prof just now mentioned some very valid points. Trade barriers, he says, is only the tip of the iceberg of an FTA. It's very true. Why do we need to engage Japan when Japan's tariffs are already 0 to 3%? It's not a barrier. And for an exporter, a 3% margin is nothing. You know, they can absorb it and still compete. But what is more important are the disciplines, the rules and regulations. The TPP negotiations is taking, I would say, three areas of negotiations. One is we are negotiating disciplines, rule making. Two, we are negotiating actual market access. That means you're opening up your market, for instance, in government procurement, which is closed, now you're opening up market. And if your textiles market in the United States is closed, yes, it's true. Average tariffs of the US is very low, 3%, 5%. But do you know that exports of our textiles, which is a $3 billion export, the tariffs on textiles is about 15 to 20%. Now imagine getting 0 duty for our textiles exports to the US. How much more can we be able to compete with China, which is the biggest exporter to the US? So while we look at average tariffs, we must look at the micro picture which Prof was talking about. So this is where we have to engage the US. Now the third angle or the third element that we are negotiating is, the first I said is rule making, 2, market access. The third is in facilitating trade and investment, trade facilitation. That's why we have chapters like customs, rules of origin, and in a new area now we have is what we call business facilitation, supply chain. Okay, because this is a regional agreement and not a bilateral agreement. There is what we call facilitating development of supply chains. So these are all facilitative measures in the TPP agreement. So all three are important for Malaysia, as we have different targets, priorities vis-a-vis the different members in the TPP. I'd like to stop here.